Right then, great. Um, just to confirm, Kush, you can hear me though.
Yeah.
Right then, great. Um, so let's get into it. All right, so this is the first ever GVMUN interview. Welcome everyone. And today we're interviewing our first ever person, Richard Gowan, who is currently the UN director at the International Crisis Group, among other positions that he holds. Richard, or Mr. Gowan, excuse me, if you want to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to chat. Yes, I am the UN representative of the International Crisis Group. Now, Crisis Group is a global conflict prevention organization. I have colleagues based in countries like Yemen and Afghanistan, tracking conflicts on the ground in real time. I am based in Manhattan, and I communicate what my colleagues are seeing and what they're saying to members of the UN Security Council, members of the UN Secretariat, and other political actors around the UN.
Great. So, if you would just like to elaborate a bit more on what exactly your role does, like what you actually do at the International Crisis Group in terms of, these conflicts in Yemen, for example, like you mentioned.
Well, so uh, we have contacts with all the parties in these conflicts. I have colleagues who talk to the Houthis in Yemen or the Taliban in Afghanistan, and we're able to get information and analysis that you know even a lot of national governments do not have about the political dynamics involved in these situations. My role is to spend time in one-to-one discussions or group discussions with diplomats working on these issues at the UN. And as I say, primarily in the Security Council here in New York, and to offer advice about how the UN could approach some of these situations more effectively. Or if we think that a crisis is being ignored and burning out of control, we will be there ringing an alarm bell saying, you have to focus harder on what's going on in this part of Africa or this part of Asia, for example.
So would you say that there's been any, significant crises or conflicts in which the International Crisis Group has been able to kind of shape UNSC policy and in response to that crisis?
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, it's been a very difficult period around the UN in recent
Yeah.
years. And we have done a lot of advocacy around certain situations like the war in Sudan or the war between Israel and Hamas, where we've offered policy advice, but it's been very difficult to get traction. But there are other occasions where we do get traction. Let me give you two examples. Uh, One is that about 5 or 6 years ago, we saw that a major famine was looming in Yemen. And we worked very hard with US counterparts, with UN officials, with the EU, to push for a ceasefire in the main Yemeni port of Hodeidah, which would allow food to get in to avoid the famine. And that was successful. And in the end, the UN did mediate a ceasefire. Food has got into the country. A lot of people's lives were saved. Similarly, after the fall of Kabul in Afghanistan in 2021, there was a period where a lot of countries were freezing aid because they didn't want to cooperate with the Taliban. And again, our analysts who were in Afghanistan said a humanitarian disaster is looming, winter is coming, there's going to be a lot of civilian lives lost to hunger unless we get this aid moving again. And we wrote a big report and we did a lot of advocacy around the report saying, even though you were angry with the Taliban, even though the Taliban have appalling gender policies, we have to get aid to the Afghan people. And that was a message which was heard in the UN system. The aid did flow. And so again, the situation there is still very grim, but I think our advocacy in both cases did help save lives.
So that genuinely sounds amazing and obviously very impactful. I think a lot of people have kind of the perception that these international groups like the UN or other NGOs don't really have an impact or effect on these international situations that we're seeing. But obviously, as someone who does model UN, I would disagree a lot. But I was also curious, what do you think are some ways that the UN could improve its approach to certain issues to potentially gain more traction and more leverage regarding the different stakeholders in these issues?
Well, so, let me say, I think a lot of what the UN does is underappreciated. I do think that the UN does a lot of life-saving work in a lot of countries, providing food, providing medical assistance, and until quite recently, we've sort of just treated that as normal, and we don't always, I think, show enough respect or appreciation for how much the UN is doing. It's interesting, the Trump administration, by freezing a lot of funding to the UN, is, I think, actually focusing some attention on how important a lot of this humanitarian work is. And I think we do hope that the Trump administration will restore a lot of funding to UN agencies like the World Food Programme, because it will become clear that this is essential. Having said that, I should also say I've been working on the UN for 20 years. That's actually 1/4 of the UN's history, because the UN is turning 80 this year. And the situation is definitely different to when I started. When I began working around the UN in 2005, the organization was sending out big blue helmet peace operations to places like Haiti, to places like Sudan. It was a different time, and the UN had more space politically to deal with conflicts. That space has narrowed. We've seen, UN peacekeepers pushed out of countries like Mali recently. And the reason for that is not really in the structure of the UN, it's in the structure of international politics. Because in a period of major power competition, when you have sort of big contests between the US and China or the US and Russia, obviously these countries are finding it harder to work together through the United Nations, through the Security Council, to cooperate on ending conflicts. So, I mean, I can think of lots of ways to improve the UN. I mean, people will tell you the UN is a huge bureaucracy, that it's slow moving. That's not always true, but there are definitely bits of the bureaucracy which could be rationalized. There are definitely ways that I think the performance of peace operations, for example, could be improved. Um, I think that the Security Council, which is still based on the power structures of 1945, clearly needs reform to give greater voice to countries like India and Brazil. But at the end of the day, none of these structural reforms will make a huge change if the big powers just do not want the UN to work and do not cooperate through the UN.
Yeah, so obviously, you mentioned this is your 20th year working with the United Nations, and it's obviously something you're extremely passionate about. I was just more curious into, what really sparked your choice to pursue a career in political science and international relations with the UN, because it's obviously something you've been doing for a while, and you seem to very enjoy it a lot, as we've seen by researching some of your career aspects.
Look, it's always annoying when people say this, but I slightly stumbled into it. I was a very geeky kid. I wanted to be an academic philosopher, but I took some time out to do some human rights work in the Balkans, in the wake of the Balkan Wars, and I suddenly started to be more interested in real politics. Um, I and in sort of peace and security issues. Um, so I worked a little bit at a institute in London, and then uh, by really really good fortune, was asked if I would want to go to New York to work at a policy institute at New York University for 2 years. That was 2005. Well, it's been more than 2 years. 2 decades later, I'm married to an American. I have two kids with thick Brooklyn accents. It's yeah, it sort of has shaped my career and shaped my life. But if there's a thread that runs through it all, it's a belief that um, we should be we should be doing what we can through political means to help the vulnerable and to protect people who otherwise, I think, would be put in peril without any support at all.
Yeah, I think that's really inspiring story, especially the part about the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars. Um, Terrible conflict, obviously. I think that a lot of people nowadays might potentially be more inspired by Model UN itself. We're kind of trying to go into that field or of international relations or just policymaking. Um, so for anyone who's currently in Model UN and wishes to go in that direction, how would you say, or what would be your best piece of advice for them to pursue that passion or hone their skills a bit more in the context of Model UN, let's say?
Well, look, I think that it's great that you're sort of practicing the art of diplomacy, and I hope your meetings go really well. I would say that if you want to work in international affairs, there are different routes in, and one route in is to work for the State Department or for the Department of Defense, and that sort of involves a specific career track. If you want to work more around an organization like the UN, there's never a single simple linear path into this sort of work. It takes time to get into this sort of work. I think that it's really helpful to develop language skills. Still, even though we live in a very Anglophone world, if you can speak Arabic or if you can speak Spanish, that opens up a lot of career possibilities in international affairs. I think that if you're really interested in development or human rights, I mean, you do need to go and spend some time after your university, maybe before you choose a postgrad route, if that's what you're going to do, spend that time abroad. You don't have to go to like the world's biggest hotspot. You don't have to go to Yemen or Afghanistan. I wouldn't advise that, frankly, as a way to start a career. But spend some time in other countries, just sort of learning to be amongst people from different cultures. And I think that teaches you something about empathy and personal interactions that is really, really important. I would say, though, obviously, the world has changed quite a lot. Now, one of the big questions around the UN is, well, will the UN have a role in regulating artificial intelligence? And so there might be completely new routes into international institutions now that are more about leveraging your knowledge of science and your knowledge of tech. It's fascinating. I think Microsoft has a big office here at the UN now. So that the way I got into it is not necessarily the way that everyone else wants to get into it.
I think that's pretty good advice. And yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways to get in. I was like personally just researching all these different organizations. It's inspiring and sometimes a bit confusing to see that there's so many groups doing work in this space. There's so many different pathways you can choose. But I also wanted to just revisit quickly a point that you talked about kind of understanding potentially different cultures or different areas of the world. I've seen a lot of your work is on multilateralism and just the concept of trying to foster collaboration with respect to cultural differences. So when trying to do this, what would you say is one thing to keep in mind? Let's say if you are a diplomat or someone who wants to work more internationally, what's the best thing to keep in mind when potentially encountering different cultural values that you might not see or approve of, let's say?
Look, so I mean, let me just also say, you asked why I continue to enjoy this work. At a more sort of personal level, one of the reasons I like working around the UN is that, especially working on the Security Council, you get to meet really smart, really thoughtful people from around the world. And, currently or recently, we've had countries on the Security Council ranging from Korea to Ecuador to Slovenia. They send very, very good diplomats to New York. You get to know them personally. And I really love just sort of having conversations with, you know, sort of a senior political officer from Japan, but, you know, we'll be sitting at the table with someone from Mozambique, someone from Ecuador, you know, that sort of multicultural aspect of multinational diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy, just keeps me that sort of keeps me awake. I think what I've learned is that, firstly, there's listening is a massively undervalued skill. I think that a lot of people think that, you know, working in politics is all about sort of talking and making your point. But actually, if you spend a bit of time just sort of listening and absorbing what people from different countries are telling you, you can synthesize that and you can really start to see problems in a very clear light. And secondly, I think it's really important to understand that actually, you know, for all our geopolitical differences, for all, you know, all the international tensions we have right now, people from most backgrounds and cultures are actually fairly similar. And so, you know, here in New York, we talk to Russian diplomats, we talk to Chinese diplomats, and, you know, obviously when we talk to the Russians, were very clear that we are profoundly against the aggression against Ukraine. But we can still find other issues where we can discuss and talk and where they want to share advice. Similarly, I think sometimes in Washington, there's a bit of demonization of certain countries. But if you spend time talking to their diplomats, you find that they are sort of, you know, they're also trying to sort of resolve problems in their national interest. And there's actually a lot more common ground there than I think a lot of people appreciate in the current day and age.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We see that aspect in MUN too, right? We are constantly meeting new people when we go to these conferences, say NISMUN in New York, for example. You meet so many people from different backgrounds, and I guess you mentioned like just listening to different perspectives is what keeps you interested, and I cannot agree more. Just based on my 1.5 2 years of body UN experience. Now, just shifting gears a bit to something you mentioned before about artificial intelligence. Obviously, we've seen the potential for ethical concerns, and just in its use for international security. How do you see the UN currently addressing it, and how does the UN, I guess, plan to um, plan to regulate it, and plans going forward, I guess.
So this has been a big topic, especially last year, and it's something which Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has been, you know, shoving states to prioritize. And last year, the UN General Assembly passed 2 resolutions on artificial intelligence, and it also agreed something called the Global Digital Compact, which is sort of a roadmap for cooperation around digital technologies, including AI. I have to say we're at a very early stage of this discussion. What people are able to agree is that we should try and work through the UN to see how digital technologies can be used to help drive economic development in poorer countries. That's a sort of a fairly straightforward area for consensus. And that's not about using high-end AI. I mean, remember, there are still billions of people around the world who just don't have internet access. And so, you can imagine projects through the UN simply wiring up sort of less economically developed communities that could, do a huge amount of good in terms of their growth and their prosperity. What is a lot more difficult is to talk about the security aspects of AI, and especially sort of the intersection between AI and nuclear weapons, for example. And there are discussions in New York and also in Geneva, but I have to say that the politics of those discussions is super, super hard. The big powers, including the US, that sort of have the lead in AI, don't want to have international organizations regulating what they're developing. That's sort of an area actually of common ground between China and the US. But I think you've got to remember, in the history of arms control, it often takes time for a consensus to emerge about the need for treaties and security frameworks. That was definitely the case with nuclear weapons. My gut feeling is that over the next 10 years, as the potential of AI becomes more and more obvious and the risks become more and more obvious, you will start to see governments saying, actually, yeah, we do need some sort of frameworks to avoid these technologies running out of control. But that's, as I say, that's a conversation which really took off in 2024. So we're in the foothills of a lot of diplomacy in this field.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point. And personally, why I like the topic of AI, I just think that there's a lot to be done as like something that is just completely new that we've never seen before. And as an aspiring policymaker, I am really invested in how the world is going to actually develop agreements or legislation to tackle the issue. Um, just shifting the topic a bit, I just wanted to really quick question on Syria. I don't think this interview would be complete without your knowledge on like a specific conflict. But I think we should make it a bit more quick just because we have a few questions from our audience just to get to. So my question is surrounding how Syria is going to kind of establish itself diplomatically, the legitimacy of a new government, as well as integrate itself into the power structures that exist, like the UN or potentially other alliances. So just how do you kind of see this happening? And what are some potential roadblocks on the way?
So I think that right now, despite the fact there have been years of arguments over Syria in the Security Council, going right back to the start of the war in 2011, everyone at the UN is quite pragmatic about the fact that Assad is gone and that it's necessary to work out sort of practical arrangements to collaborate with the new government. Now, some countries like China and Russia are concerned that the new government had jihadist roots. But even they say, a degree of pragmatism is necessary. So I think that there is also a lot the UN can offer the new government in terms of technical assistance on how to run the country, humanitarian support. And we're hoping that actually this will be one area where the UN does get over all its internal differences and can help stand up the new state. One big obstacle that we do need to get around, and that my organization is working on at the moment, is that there are still UN sanctions on the new Syrian leadership. And we're going to have to find a way to suspend or lift those sanctions sooner rather than later, because that is a source of mistrust between Damascus and the UN, and it also sort of makes it harder to get help to the Syrian people without breaking certain laws.
Yeah, that's just really interesting. I just wonder if you want to add anything before we get into delegate questions.
No, let's go.
I mean, I don't think so. I think we can answer the
Yeah,
question, especially because you do have a busy schedule and we do want to respect this.
yeah. So, in anticipation of today's interview, we sent out a Google form to all of our delegates from our past 5 conferences. And I guess we can start by saying, someone asked, what is your greatest achievement as a UN official and why? And if you don't mind, keep these answers fairly brief as we do have quite a few questions.
Okay, I mean, I should say that I've never been a full-time UN official. I've always worked sort of in organizations like Crisis Group next to the UN. But of the things that we've done at Crisis Group, I would point to what I said about Afghanistan. I think at a very difficult moment, we went out and we sort of pushed for life-saving aid to Afghans in a period where very few governments really wanted to focus on Afghanistan because they were so stung by the fall of Kabul. And I think that was morally the right thing to do, and I think we had an impact.
Okay. So moving on, someone asked that do you believe diplomacy is still, fairly effective in today's world in an era where power politics have seemed to, become larger?
I think that power politics are complicating diplomacy. It's making it harder to get agreements on many issues and many conflicts, as we've seen over Ukraine and Gaza. But I think that actually, if you're at the UN, what you see is that the majority of the world's countries still want to resolve their problems through diplomacy. By historical standards, we're still in a period where there are very, very few interstate wars, although some of the wars that do exist, like Ukraine, have an appalling cost. And so actually, I think that there is more diplomacy out there, and more countries still want to work diplomatically than we sometimes recognize.
All right. So this delegate actually allowed us to mention their names. So Krishna Dalapalli from New Jersey asked that what's the process in which delegates receive instructions from their state's government about their stance on various UN meetings?
Well, I mean, all UN delegations are in constant contact, by email with their capitals and their foreign ministries. And even in a very fast-moving crisis, diplomats will be referring back to their capitals for instruction. Some countries work on a basis where the capital makes all the decisions. Some countries, especially smaller ones, give the diplomats in New York more freedom of maneuver and sort of say, you're the ones on the ground. We'll trust your instincts. Usually it's a bit of a mix of both. But in today's interconnected world, I can talk to someone in Seoul or I can talk to someone in Islamabad, and ask for instructions, very quickly.
Right,
It's
thank
pretty
you. I
interesting.
think that's we
Yeah.
will end off the questions for today, seeing as it is 30 local time. Um, First of all, I'd like to thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with us for this interview. I think your perspectives were really insightful, and honestly, it kind of like um restored my faith in the UN and these global power structures in a way, especially your work with Afghanistan and Yemen. I think that what's reported in the news often is kind of just the failures, like the points that countries disagree on. But then when we have agreements, like the biggest one that I recall would be the Montreal protocol to save the ozone layer. But yeah, I'm really interested to see how your organization as well as the UN overall continues its role into the 21st century and kind of just overcome some of the new problems that are facing us. So,
Well, we will keep trying, and I hope that you guys and all the other delegates at least consider looking for careers uh, in this field. Because although it has turned my hair prematurely white, I would thoroughly recommend it as a fascinating career if it opens up for you.
all right, thank you so much and have a nice day.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.